The adventure I'm about to share takes me back to my youth. I was newly married in those days, and life was good. My father owned several properties, including houses and shops, but he preferred to live a simple life, staying in the countryside and enjoying the beauty of the village. In addition to me, my father had two other children, and he always made it clear, "Don't think I'll give you my property while I'm alive. You have to work hard and earn your own living. When I'm gone, and my head rests beneath the earth, you can do whatever you want with it." At that time, I was a humble army officer with little to my name. I had bought a piece of my father's land, paying for it in installments from my monthly salary. The land was in a forested area with a breathtaking view and a small fountain nearby. As my income grew, I built a spacious villa on that land. It became a retreat for my wife and me during holidays, a place where we could breathe in the fresh air and escape the daily grind. One year, I managed to secure a 10-day leave. We hadn't visited the villa in a long time, so I decided we'd spend the entire vacation there. For once, I wouldn't stop by the village to see my family. We packed our bags and planned to leave for the villa the next morning. That night, just as we were preparing for bed, the phone rang. It was my brother-in-law, and his voice was filled with panic. He explained that his wife, my sister-in-law, had been hit by a car and had broken both her legs. The next day, instead of heading to the villa, we went straight to the hospital. Her condition was worse than I'd imagined. Along with her fractured legs, she had suffered a severe head injury. My wife was heartbroken when she saw her sister like that and started crying. She asked me to cancel our trip, explaining she couldn't leave her sister in such a state while we went off to enjoy ourselves. She then suggested that I go to the villa alone for a few days to unwind. I hesitated. Since building the villa, I had never gone there without her, and the thought of enjoying it alone felt wrong. I waited a day, hoping her sister's condition would improve so my wife could join me. But the doctors informed us that multiple surgeries would be needed, and she would have to remain in the hospital for some time. That day, my wife came home after a few hours and said, "You should go back to the hospital tonight so that my sister isn't left alone." I replied, "I've already used up 2 days of my leave. When are we going to the villa?" Kim gave me a stern look and said, "My sister is unwell. How can I leave her in this condition and come with you?" She was right, of course, but I had been eagerly planning this trip. She gently placed her hand on mine and said, "Why don't you go ahead, clean up the villa a little, and I'll join you tomorrow or the day after." Though it felt strange to go without her, I agreed. She promised to join me soon. I packed my bags, changed my clothes, and set out for the villa. On the way north, I stopped to buy some groceries before heading into the woods. The path to the villa wasn't paved, and the car wheels struggled against the muddy road. The journey from the city to the villa took about 3.5 hours. It was pouring rain, and the thick fog made driving even more difficult. Eventually, I reached the villa and parked the car in the driveway. It had been about 8 months since I last visited. The leafy trees in the courtyard had shed their leaves, covering the entire ground. To my surprise, the lamp in the living room was on. Lee, an old man of 75, lived alone. He had lost his wife years ago and had worked as one of my father's servants. Since the day I built the villa, Lee had taken on the role of caretaker. The rain continued to pour heavily as I walked to the door and knocked. Lee opened it, looked at me, and said, "Welcome, sir. What brings you here?" I joked, "If you wanted them back?" He laughed and said, "You have the authority, sir. Would you like some tea?" I replied, "Don't trouble yourself. Just give me the key to the villa." Lee went into the booth and returned a few seconds later with the key. I took the key and entered the villa. It was dark inside. I turned on the lights. The autumn season was far colder than the winter had been, and the chill in the air was sharp. I lit the fireplace. A few moments later, Lee brought me the tea. The villa began to warm up slightly, but my hands and feet were still freezing. Lee left, and I was alone in the villa. I poured myself a glass of tea and sat down by the fireplace. The tea tasted awful, like drinking dirt. It must be old, I thought to myself. I set the tea aside and leaned my head back against the sofa. I was tired and didn't realize when I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. It was quiet. Except for the fading glow of the fireplace, there was no light anywhere. The rain was still falling, and the lightning would occasionally light up the entire room, shaking the glass with every strike. I searched through the rooms for a flashlight, but I couldn't find one. The fireplace had gone out, and the only light was from the occasional flash of lightning. I glanced out the window and noticed the light in Lee's room was off. I thought about going to get a lamp, but since it was midnight and Lee was likely asleep, I decided against it. The villas were far apart in the woods, and our villa was isolated from the others. The nearest one was 2 kilometers away. The lighter in my pocket had fallen to the ground, and in the dark, I fumbled around until I found it. I flicked it on and made my way to the bedroom to grab a blanket. I dropped the key and opened the door. My hand was burning from the heat of the lighter. The lighter fell, and I leaned over to pick it up. I turned it on again, and just as I did, right in front of my eyes, I saw a woman with a horribly distorted face. Her eyes were fixed on me, and she was smiling. Without thinking, I screamed and was thrown backward, crashing to the ground. I was so scared that I had no idea where the lighter fell. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she disappeared. There was absolute darkness everywhere. I was terrified. There was a whistle from a reception window. I knew I had closed the window, so how it had opened was a mystery to me. The storm outside was violent, and the rain didn't seem like it was going to stop. It seemed as though the windows could shatter at any moment from the vibrations. I rushed to close the window and then headed back to the fireplace. The ashes were still a little warm. I held my hands up to warm them. Suddenly the window opened loudly and slammed against the wall. I was so frightened that I jumped a meter off the ground. I went over to the window to close it again, but the wind had stopped. Despite the trouble, I closed the window and looked out into the courtyard. Just then a flash of lightning lit up the yard, and in that light I saw Lee, sweating with fear, heading towards the front door. I started running. Lee had been standing behind the door with a candle in his hand. I was confused, not understanding what was happening at all. I asked Lee, "What are you doing here?" He looked at me calmly and said, "I saw the lightning go out, and it was dark, so I brought you candles." I took a candle from him and asked, "Lee, didn't you notice anything strange?" He thought for a moment and then replied, "Strange? Like what?" I said, "For example, a stranger came here." He shook his head and said, "No, sir, no one came." "How is that possible? Have your things moved?" I said, "No, no one moved." There was a brief pause. Then I said, "Let it go. Nothing important." "By the way, Lee, what tea was that? I still have a dry mouth." Lee responded, "Sorry, sir, I'm brewing another tea now." I said, "You don't have to anymore." Lee shook his head and said, "You know, sir." Then he walked to his room. I locked the door, entered the living room, and found the lighter with the candle still lit. I placed the candle on the table, lit a cigarette, and sat by the fireplace. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I never dared to sleep. I was never alone, and I thought to myself, it's all an illusion. Loneliness. Don't be afraid. Go to sleep comfortably. I was lost in these thoughts when suddenly the candle went out for no reason. I lit it again. I hadn't even sat down yet when the candle went out again. I looked at the door, the dark space of the room. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Except for the ticking clock, the wind made no sound, and sometimes from afar the howling of a wolf. I walked to the candle and lit it again. But as soon as I turned my head, she was there, the old woman, clinging right to my face. I fell to the ground in terror. "Lee!" I screamed, but there was no response. Then the electricity came back on, and the entire villa lit up. I was gasping for breath. Shaken, I got up and turned on the lights in each room one by one. I looked everywhere, but there was no sign of the old woman. I couldn't believe it. I told myself it was all just an illusion, a fantasy. But I was completely alert, wide awake from sheer panic. I didn't close my eyes until morning. I turned on all the lamps and waited for the air to clear. I didn't understand. Who had fallen asleep? Who was sleeping? The sound of the door woke me. I looked out the window. It was raining. The weather was strangely comforting. Lee was standing behind the door. He had brought me a breakfast tray. I opened the door, took the tray from him, and thanked him. He asked, "Why was the door locked?" I didn't want him to know what had happened. I didn't want him to worry. I simply said, "No reason." He looked at me for a moment and then asked, "How many times did the screams come last night? Was that you?" My heart pounded. I forced a small laugh and said, "Me? No, it must have been the wind." Hearing my answer, he lowered his head and walked away. I wasn't very hungry. I dumped the breakfast into the trash, lost in thought. Why hadn't he come out of his room when I screamed? I kept thinking about it when my wife called. She told me that in 2 days her sister would be discharged from the hospital, and she would return safely herself. I kept whining to myself, wondering, was it time to leave? Even though I was scared, I wanted to stay in the villa a little longer and spend the rest of my vacation there. I decided to walk around the property and renovate it if needed. Because of the rain, the night air was thick with the scent of flowers. Everywhere I stepped, I crushed blossoms beneath my feet. It was strange. The season wasn't right for flowers to be in bloom. Something about my arrival felt wrong. I was wandering around the villa when I heard a strange sound. It was faint, like someone calling my name, whispering. After what I had seen the night before, I wasn't brave enough to investigate. I felt like I was always waiting for something unexpected to happen. Heart pounding, I hurried back into the house and grabbed the gun I had hidden. I rushed out of the house and headed toward the place where I had heard the sound. Then I heard it again. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I shouted again, louder this time, "Who's there?" Still, silence. I stepped forward cautiously. Suddenly, something shot past me at an incredible speed. Instinctively, I raised my gun and fired. Bang! I gasped, my heart racing. Had I hit something? I scanned the darkness, but there was no one there. After searching for a while, I gave up and made my way back to the villa. Something felt off. Lee was nowhere to be found. I called his name. No answer. I walked to his room and knocked on the door. Silence. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I turned around and started walking toward the main part of the villa when, "Did you need something, sir?" Lee's voice came from behind me. I spun around. He stood there watching me. My throat went dry. I stammered, You weren't here just now." I looked. Lee chuckled. "Then where was I, sir?" I hesitated. My eyes darted to his room. Lying in bed, he continued, still smiling. I glanced inside the room again. It was empty. I forced a smile and nodded. "Right, of course." I didn't push the conversation further. Something was very wrong. I told Lee that I wanted to go on a tour of the city. Just then, a frail-looking cat wandered into the yard. There was something unsettling about it. I watched as its eyes gleamed in the dim light, following its gaze until it disappeared from view. A strange sense of unease crept over me. I shook it off and went back inside the villa. Suddenly, a sharp pain pulsed through my head. I groaned, gripping my temples. Something wasn't right. Trying to shake off the discomfort, I checked my gun, loaded it, and hid it under my shirt. I needed a distraction. I decided to call my wife. Dialing her number, I pressed the phone to my ear. When she answered, her voice was sharp. Angry. "Why haven't you called me since you left?" she demanded. I frowned. What? What do you mean? I talked to you this morning." There was a pause, then she snapped. "Are you joking? When did I call you?" A chill ran down my spine. I laughed nervously. "Come on, don't mess with me. You called me this morning. We talked." "I never called you." Her voice was firm. My stomach twisted. If that wasn't her, then who had I spoken to? It was her voice. I was sure of it. But if it was really her, why was she so angry, so certain she hadn't called? As the thought formed in my mind, the light suddenly went out. The villa was plunged into darkness. My breath hitched. I pulled the gun from under my shirt, gripping it tightly. And then I waited. I felt like I was reliving last night's nightmare. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Despite the warmth, a cold dread settled in my chest. It was late. The villa stood silent. But I knew Lee wasn't asleep. He never was at this hour. I glanced out the window, and then I saw her, a woman with a grotesque, twisted face. She was coming toward the villa, a candle flickering in her hand. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back into the shadows, pressing myself into the darkness. The knocking came, sharp, insistent. I didn't move, didn't answer, just waited. The door creaked open. Lee stepped inside, his face unreadable, his movements strangely hesitant. He glanced around, his expression shadowed with something I couldn't name. And then I saw her. She stepped in behind him. My pulse pounded in my ears. She looked like my wife. "Honey, didn't you wait for me?" she cooed. The voice was hers. But the face was shifting. I raised my gun and fired. Shot after shot rang through the air. She kept coming. Her face contorted, shifting into something monstrous. I kept shooting. The deafening blasts echoed through the villa, waking the neighbors. Doors swung open. People rushed to my house, and then silence. Lee's body lay on the floor. I stood there breathless, the gun trembling in my grip. I turned to the neighbors, my voice shaking as I told them everything. We stepped inside together, the air thick with tension. But there was nothing, no body, no blood, nothing, just the heavy, suffocating silence. They looked at me then, their eyes filled with doubt, with suspicion, as if I were either insane or a liar.